who are set to leave the average household £870 worse off through stealth taxes and increases in council tax. The Prime Minister claims that he is delivering for the country. But the British people did not order what this Prime Minister is delivering. You have to ask yourself, is this the limit of their ambitions for Britain? And if you want to know what 5 more years of the Conservatives would look like, you just have to look at their record over the last 14. The greatest tax burden in 70 years. National debt at the highest it has been since the 1960s. Families paying hundreds of pounds more on monthly mortgage bills. Prices still significantly higher in the shops. Economic growth on the floor. If the UK economy had have grown at the average rate of the other OECD economies over the last 14 years, it would today be £140 billion bigger, providing an additional £50 billion worth of tax revenues to invest in our public services. Instead, the Tory legacy is a Britain that is poorer, working people worse off, taxes rising, yet public services have never been in a deeper crisis. Let me be clear. Keir Starmer and I will not be doing a victory lap for finally meeting the inflation target for the first time in 3 years. And we won't be doing a victory lap negative growth to no growth. If Jeremy Hunt wants to call it a technical recession, then I assume that he's comfortable in calling this a technical recovery. Not a recovery for working people, not a recovery for families struggling with a mortgage, not a recovery from 14 years of Conservative economic failure. No, we won't have turned a corner until working people feel that they are better off. Because the state of the economy is about much more than lines on a graph. It's about the state of our high streets, the security of work, the money in people's pockets. So what is the Tories' last desperate throw of the dice? A £46 billion unfunded plan to abolish national insurance contributions. If Labour had have put forward a similar proposal, voters, journalists and our political opponents would be demanding to know where the money was going to come from. And they'd be right. And yet, 2 months on from the spring budget, and despite having countless opportunities to clarify their plans, there are still no answers from ministers on how they will pay for it. What services will they cut? What other taxes will they put up? What changes will they make to the state pension? New analysis has shown that replacing national insurance contribution revenues with income tax would mean rates of income tax going up by 8 percentage points. A tax bombshell aimed squarely at Britain's pensioners. There is no coherent argument behind the plan either. And you don't have to take my word for it, because it was the Prime Minister's hero, the former Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, who dismissed the idea of abolishing national insurance contributions nearly 40 years ago. He advised the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, that such a choice had, and I quote, little practical merit, that it would destroy the contributory principle and create many losers, especially among the elderly. Now, I realise that a few weeks ago I spent a long time arguing in my Mays lecture that Nigel Lawson was wrong. But on this, he was right. And his argument then is still right today. But Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are ploughing ahead with this reckless plan in a desperate attempt to keep their divided party together. More tunes from the Liz Truss songbook. It's party first and country second. Chaos over stability. Recklessness over responsibility. Decline over prosperity. That is the Conservatives' record in power. And now, all Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt can offer is more of the same. low growth, higher taxes, and public services in deep decline, putting out the same soundbites over and over again and hoping that something will turn up, that their record of failure will somehow be forgiven or forgotten, or that people will finally believe them. Neither will happen, because the Conservatives' economic model has failed on its own terms. Their plan is not working. We have not turned the corner. They've crashed the car and left it by the side of the road, content to be the managers of decline. And what they're really saying is that this is the best that you can hope for. But I know that we can do so much better. People want change, and it falls to us, to the Labour Party, to offer that change, to show the ambition that the British people deserve, the ambition that they feel for their families, their communities, and their country. Not gimmicks, not shortcuts, no more pursuit of narrow political dividing lines at the expense of the national interest, but facing unflinchingly and without illusions the inheritance that we will face, bringing a laser focus to bear on the barriers to economic growth, so that we can achieve our mission of having the fastest growth in the G7, with good jobs and productivity growth in all parts of the country, offering a plan for a new economy, driving the economic growth which will raise living standards, resource public services, and let Britain compete in the world once again. Now, I know what critics say. Doesn't everyone want economic growth? I know that warm words are not enough, and I do not underestimate the challenges that we will face. But I know the huge potential found right across Britain. The constraints that are holding that potential back, they're not immutable forces. But overcoming them requires vision, courage, and responsible government. Vision, to pursue a different approach, drawing on new economic thinking, shaping governments in Europe, in America, and right around the world. Courage, to put the public interest before short-term party politics, taking on the vested interests that hold our country back. And responsible government, offering stability of direction in a fast-changing world. Because after years of chaos and short-term thinking, at this election, stability is change. The stability on which households and businesses alike rely if they are to plan ahead for the future. Stability underpinned by a strong set of fiscal rules and robust independent institutions like the Treasury, the Bank of England, and the Office for Budget Responsibility. And stability of purpose, enshrined in national missions to bring government and business together to meet the challenges of the future. Alongside stability, investment. Because investment is the lifeblood of economic growth. It provides the tools and the machinery that workers use to do their jobs. It ensures the infrastructure is there for goods to move around the country and for people to get to work. And it drives innovation and the diffusion of ideas and technology, the long-term determinants of higher productivity and wage growth. That's why Labour will work in partnership with business to remove the barriers to investment. And that partnership will be embodied in a modern industrial strategy. With Great British Energy, a new national energy champion located in Scotland, and a national wealth fund, providing catalytic public investment to unlock more than £20 billion of private sector investment in our towns, cities and regions. And alongside stability and alongside investment, reform. Reform of employment rights with a new deal for working people. Because there is now a mountain of economic evidence that fair pay and in-work security are crucial not only to fairness and dignity, but to our productivity too. Reform to our politics, because Britain today has one of the most centralised political systems in the world, and some of the highest levels of geographic inequality too. So we will work closely with our newly elected mayors and our local leaders to deliver for their regions. And we will introduce a new Take Back Control Act, new powers for elected mayors over transport, skills, enterprise, energy and planning. The powers to revitalise our high streets and generate shared local growth through local growth plans, to play their part in a national mission, to close the festering gaps between our regions, our towns and our cities. Reform of our planning system so we can get Britain building again. Because nowhere is the economic influence of vested interests more pernicious than in our planning system. It has become a graveyard of economic ambition and a byword for political timidity in the face of vested interests. That's why a Labour government will put planning reform at the very heart of our economic and political agenda and mark an end to the prevarication and political short-termism. This programme is based on a different view of the economy. It is what I call securonomics, an approach that seeks to build economic growth on strong and secure foundations, rejecting the outdated assumptions of the past and recognising that in a new age of insecurity, the only viable strategy for growth must put the economic security of households and the resilience of our national economy front and centre. With an active, strategic state working in partnership with business, with our international allies and with our local leaders. It is one of the great privileges of this job to get away from Westminster, to see the brilliant things being done by working people, by inventors and entrepreneurs, by businesses in every part of Britain. To see a country, a people, so rich in potential, but potential too often frustrated. It is Labour's mission to change that, to unlock that potential. It will take time, a decade of national renewal, but we will not shy from the challenges that we face. It is time for an end to the excuses, the short-termism, and putting politics before the public interest. The Prime Minister can just say the word. We are ready. Labour will fight the next election on the economy. Every day we will expose what the Conservatives have done to our country. Because instead of believing the Prime Minister's claims that we've turned a corner, the questions that people will ask ahead of the next election are simple. Do you and your family feel better off after 14 years of Conservative government? Do our schools, our hospitals, our police, our transport work better than they did 14 years ago? Frankly, does anything in our country work better than when the Conservatives came to office 14 years ago? The choice at the next general election is simple. 5 more years of chaos with the Conservatives that will continue Britain on a path of economic decline, or stability with a changed Labour Party that can offer hope with a long-term plan to make working people better off. It is time to turn the page, to start a new chapter in Britain's economic future. And Labour is ready. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to take some questions now. We'll start with Faisal from the BBC.
Shadow Chancellor, can I just get your response to the suggestion from the Prime Minister that we're facing a hung Parliament and Labour would have to preside over a kind of chaotic coalition? And then you specifically reference again the learning from the experience of the US Bidenomics. Obviously, you rode back on the £28 billion plan. Can you clarify, if the economic situation allowed and it was better, would you countenance borrowing that money because you could, or are you now against that idea in principle and think it was bad in retrospect?
Thanks for those questions. Look, no votes have been cast in the next general election when we're fighting for every single vote. But the results last week, not just the percentage shares or the number of councils won or the number of mayors won, including, of course, in the Prime Minister's own backyard in North Yorkshire, but the places that we were winning are the places that we need to win to form the next government. And we can feel confident coming out of those elections that the message that we are putting forward is resonating. And I don't think that the results last week point to a hung parliament, but we know that we need to fight for every single vote in the next election, and we're determined to do just that. As you mentioned, Faisal, last year I spent some time in the US and met with Janet Yellen, as well as some of the architects of President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the pieces of advice that they gave was that it's not just about money. And in fact, when I talk to investors and what it is that holds them back from investing more in Britain, including in some of those low-carbon industries of the future, is our planning system. The gap between making a choice to invest in Britain and then that planning coming to realisation, whether it is onshore or offshore wind, whether it is carbon capture or green hydrogen. The planning system works and mitigates against investment in Britain. So as we have set our plans as part of the Green Prosperity Plan, planning is front and centre of those plans to tackle the vested interests that cause the delays and to also speed up the grid connections so that we can get that new energy to market. But alongside that, we also have the creation of a National Wealth Fund endowed with £7.3 billion of public money to invest alongside business and to crowd in private investment. And the National Wealth Fund Task Force met for the first time a couple of weeks ago. That includes the former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, the Chief Executives of Aviva, of L&G and of Barclays, so that we can work in opposition, so we can quickly get on with delivering those plans in government. And I don't think it requires the £28 billion of investment we first set out to achieve our objectives, to get to clean energy by 2030 and to deliver the jobs, the energy security and the good jobs. And that we can do that through other means, including the creation of GB Energy, the National Wealth Fund and, crucially, those planning reforms. The next question is from Jasmine at ITV News.
Hi. In light of the events unfolding in Rafah, do you think it's time to end UK arms sales to Israel? Would a Labour government commit to that? And on the economy, what's your response to those who say you aren't being honest with the public about the trade-offs required, that you may ultimately end up introducing departmental cuts and tax hikes?
Thanks for those questions. There should be no invasion of Rafah, and Labour have been very clear about that. The impact that it would have on civilians, the impact it is already having on civilians, is just too much. And I urge both Israel and Hamas to bring forward that cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire that is now more urgent and more needed than ever. On the issue of arms sales, international law is very clear on this point. If the sales of arms was going to be used in a way that risks breaching international humanitarian law, those arms sales should not go ahead, and we would judge everything on that basis. In terms of being honest with people, look, I'm under no illusions about the scale of the challenge that I would inherit if I become Chancellor of the Exchequer later this year. It's the worst economic inheritance that any Chancellor would have faced since the Second World War in terms of taxes, growth, living standards and the public finances. The government are not even willing to set out a spending review because they know the scale of the challenges. I've already set out how we would put an immediate injection of cash into some of our frontline public services, for example, cracking down on tax avoidance that the National Audit Office say could bring in up to £5 billion a year, tough rules on non-doms, because if you make your home in Britain you should pay your taxes here, and VAT and business rates on private school fees. All of that money would go into frontline public services, but then we've got to grow the economy, and that is my focus and Keir Starmer's focus and what I set out in the speech today. Thank you, Jasmine. Darren from Sky News.
Good morning, Rachel. Hi. Just on this idea about feelings, you seem to have talked an awful lot about feelings this morning. Is this an actual policy of Labour's now, that economic success is not just measured on data, but actually on how people feel? And if that is the case, how do we work that out? Because do we just go, as you seem to have done today, and ask a number of people how they feel about the economy? Is there a measurement involved in all of this? And aren't you kind of making a rod for your own back this morning in that no matter what the data is, if you become Chancellor, the media, the opposition will always be able to find people who are losing, who are not feeling the benefits of a growing economy? And just second of all, on the MOD hack with China, do you think that the government is taking a tough enough line on relations with China? Would a Labour government go further?
Well, thanks very much. Well, look, I love a spreadsheet and a graph as much as the next person. I've spent the early part of my career looking at them obsessively. But in the end, what success looks like is how people feel, whether there is money in their bank balance, whether they've got enough to pay the rent, the mortgage, the bills, and have enough aside for the little luxuries that make life worth living. And for too many people today, that is just not the reality. When the Prime Minister and Chancellor say, we've turned a corner, the plan is working, look out for the feel-good factor, I think that's deluded, and it's really out of touch with the realities that people are facing. And so the mark of success is whether people feel they're better off, and whether, frankly, people are better off at the end of this Parliament than they were at the start. Because it is a unique achievement of this government that this will be the first Parliament ever where living standards are lower at the end than they were at the beginning. And that is not a record to be proud of. And yet you've got this bizarre situation at the moment where Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are going on some sort of victory lap for getting minimal growth rather than being in recession, meeting the inflation target for the first time in 3 years. I'm just so much more ambitious for our country than that. I want living standards to be sustainably improving, for businesses to feel that they can invest and making those choices to invest in Britain, and that is the sign of success, not merely meeting the inflation target and not being in recession, which seems to be the government's mark of success today. On this leaking of MOD personnel data, it's obviously deeply concerning for us as a nation, but also deeply concerning for those people serving today in our armed forces or who have served in the armed forces in the past, who should be able to trust their data, their bank details, their addresses with the Ministry of Defence. And so the government has certainly got questions to answer today, and I'm sure that there'll be a statement later today. I think with China, we should work with China where it's in our national interests to do so. But in areas that are crucial to our national security, we do need to take a hard line, including, for example, on the role of China in financing energy infrastructure or digital technology. But there are areas where we do want to cooperate and work with China, whether that is on trade, whether it is international security, or indeed addressing the climate crisis. The next question is Liam Halligan from GB News.
Thank you, Shadow Chancellor. You talked about the need for strong institutions underpinning your secure economics vision, not least the Treasury, the Bank of England and the OBR. As a former Bank of England employee, you will surely have noticed last week when former Governor Mervyn King said in the Lords that the MPC was riven with groupthink and a lack of cognitive diversity. He was indeed reflecting the conclusions of a cross-party report from the House of Lords Economic Affairs Select Committee. Do you think that's a fair characterisation of the MPC, the former governor saying that that lack of cognitive diversity had added to instability, led to higher inflation than would otherwise be the case? And also, do you think the OBR should be stronger or weaker than it currently is? Specifically, should elected politicians take more notice or less notice of OBR forecasts, which have often been rather, to be fair, inaccurate?
Well, I think that we should respect independent economic institutions. And One of the reasons why we are in the mess that we are in today is because of the decisions of the Conservatives when Liz Truss was Prime Minister and Kwasi Kwarteng was Chancellor. It wasn't just the unfunded tax cuts that they promised, but it was also the undermining of the economic institutions that had previously made Britain a safe and secure place to invest. So sacking the respected Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, Tom Scholar, refusing to let the OBR do a forecast even though they said they were able to, or spending the leadership campaign undermining the Bank of England. All of those contributed to the financial and economic crisis that we faced just 18 months ago. And I think the lessons from that is that we should respect more and listen more to those independent economic institutions rather than seek to further undermine them. And that would certainly be my approach as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Brian Saby from The Sun.
Shadow Chancellor, during your speech you said that the Tory legacy had made people worse off. Are you considering anything about unfreezing personal tax thresholds to make people better off and actually giving people more money in their pockets?
Thank you, Ryan. I've made no bones about wanting taxes on working people to be lower. The tax burden is the highest it's been in 70 years and it's due to go up in each of the next 5 years. But I'm not willing to do what Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss and a litany of Conservative ministers and MPs are willing to do, which is to make unfunded commitments, because that is the way to economic ruin. So when resources allow, I would like taxes on working people to be lower, but I'm not going to make any unfunded tax cuts or spending commitments, unlike the £46 billion unfunded commitment that the government has made around national insurance that can only mean one of three things. Changes to the state pension, either reducing it, means testing it, or having a higher state pension age, cuts to public services, including the NHS, or indeed higher taxes elsewhere. And the research that we published today shows that you would have to add 8 pence to both the basic and higher rate of income tax to compensate for getting rid of national insurance contributions. That would be a tax squarely aimed at Britain's pensioners, who deserve better than that. Next question from Hugo at the Eye.
Thank you, Shadow Chancellor. The government has recently announced a series of reforms to out-of-work and disability benefits. Labour has not yet put forward its sort of full alternative, but a lot of campaigners in the sector say that one of the things the system needs is more funding. Would you be willing to put in more funding to the benefit system, or, given your very tight fiscal constraints, will it have to do the work it needs to do within its current funding envelope?
Well, as much as Ryan and you may tempt me, I'm not going to be making any unfunded spending commitments, Hugo. Look, if people can work, they should be in work. And there's a clue in the name. We're the Labour Party. We are the party of work, and think that work is good for people's mental and physical health, as well as contributing to a strong and secure economy. But the government need to do more to ensure that people who are able to work. And when you've got a backlog of more than 7 million on NHS waiting lists, it's hardly surprising that some people are not able to work today. And that's why we've said that we would have a crackdown on tax avoidance, and also ensure that non-DOMs pay their fair share of tax in Britain, and put that money into 2 million additional appointments a year in our NHS to clear that backlog, as well as having mental health support in all secondary schools and mental health hubs in local communities to help ensure that everybody who can work is doing so, something that this Conservative government is not able to guarantee. Lizzie from The Mirror.
Thank you. Union leaders have been warning in recent days against any watering down of the New Deal for working people, including Unite, which suggested it might divert funds away from the party if that happens. Can you commit to delivering the legislation as promised in the first 100 days, including the 0 hours contract ban?
I can commit that in the first 100 days of a Labour government, we will put forward legislation, as we've already set out on the New Deal for working people, including banning those exploitative 0 hour contracts. And as I said in my speech today, not only is this the right and the fair thing to do, but it's also good for the economy, because there's now mounting evidence that shows that more secure work results in both more motivated workforce, but also workers who are more willing to move jobs because that they can be guaranteed the security in work. Now, of course, we will consult in government on how to implement these plans, but we are absolutely committed to deliver that new deal for working people in full, as we've committed to do so. The next question is from Chris from The Times.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that point about workers' rights, many business people have expressed concerns about this. So what is your message to them? Many of them might be in this room. Is it that even if they don't like it, they're going to have to lump it? Or did your last answer suggest that you're saying to them that you know better how to run their businesses and get the most out of their staff than they do? And just on the election results, you seem pretty upbeat about last week's results. So when the Prime Minister says, as he did last night, that things are a lot closer than many people think, is he deluded there as well?
First of all, on the New Deal for working people, well, you know, the truth is that many, many businesses already go well beyond what is set out in the New Deal for working people. They don't have zero-hour contracts. They are not using practices of fire and rehire. They give better rights around sick pay, for example. And so businesses have got nothing to fear from the New Deal for working people. But businesses who do use these methods, then there will be a level playing field to ensure that businesses can't undercut each other by using zero-hour contracts, for example, or through fire and rehire. But Angela and myself and Johnny Reynolds have spent a lot of time talking to businesses about how this will work for them. And so, for example, on zero-hour contracts, after 12 weeks, if you've been working regular hours, you will be able to get that permanent contract. But if you want that flexibility as a worker, you can remain on the contract you're on. It's just about saying that the flexibility can't be all one way. And there will be nothing in Labour legislation that would stop employers from using overtime, for example, or taking workers on a seasonal basis to fulfil demands at Christmas or during summer. So businesses have got nothing to fear from Labour's New Deal for working people. And of course, we will consult on how to implement these things so that there aren't any unforeseen adverse consequences from it. But we're committed to the New Deal for working people. It's an important part of our economic offer, both to build a stronger and more resilient economy and to ensure that working people benefit from a growing economy. If Rishi Sunak is so convinced that the election is so close, there's one way to test that: call a general election and let the people decide. Next question from Kieran Stacey from The Guardian.
Thank you very much. Just one more on the New Deal for workers' rights. You said to Lizzie that you want to bring forward legislation in the first 100 days, but you've also talked about the need to consult. Will you commit to actually bringing legislation forward to Parliament and starting the parliamentary process within those first 100 days, rather than it just being a piece of draft legislation which you consult on? And then a separate one, if I can, about the local election results. One aspect of them that we saw is, in certain areas, Muslim voters turning away from Labour. Is that an area of concern for you, and what can you do to reverse that trend?
Firstly, on the New Deal for working people, I'll just say again, we will bring forward legislation in the first 100 days of a Labour government. Of course, we would then consult on that, both within those 100 days and afterwards as it goes through the normal parliamentary process. But that legislation will be brought forward in the first 100 days of a Labour government. On the second issue, everybody who sees the scenes unfolding on our television screens, including this weekend with what is happening in Rafah and people being displaced multiple times, but also people that have seen the taking of innocent hostages from a music festival and from a kibbutz in Israel, can't be helped but be moved by those scenes. And that's why we have called for an immediate ceasefire to allow aid into Gaza unimpeded, but also the release of those hostages that are still in underground tunnels in Gaza. They must be freed as well. Now, I recognise that there are some people who didn't vote for Labour last week because they did have concerns, including people in the Muslim community. And I regret whenever someone decides that they can't bring themselves to vote for the Labour Party, and we will seek to rebuild the trust of those communities in the weeks and months ahead. A final question from George Parker at the FT.
Thank you, Shadow Chancellor. You said that stability has changed, and understandably you like to use Liz Truss's short premiership as your starting point for that. I'd just like to ask you whether you think that Jeremy Hunt has actually made some progress in stabilising things. After all, you seem to have supported everything he said in his last 2 fiscal events. You backed his Edinburgh reforms. Are you, to a certain extent, continuity Jeremy Hunt in many areas? And linked to that, you cited Nigel Lawson as being opposed to the abolition of national insurance contributions. Why do you keep voting for cuts to them then?
So when things are put forward that are fully costed and fully funded with an OBR forecast, I think that's very different from a forward offer of a £46 billion offer with absolutely no clarity on how that will be funded and how that will be paid for. Those two things are materially different, and it goes back, I guess, to the question that Liam Halligan asked earlier, that independent forecasts are really important when it comes to making fiscal decisions. In terms of stability, well, it was Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt that tipped the UK economy into recession at the end of last year. And while they might like to call it a technical recession, I think that what we're going to see later this week is just a technical recovery, with the economy bouncing back from recession, but still skirting along the bottom in terms of our growth performance. And, you know, if you look at the forecasts, not just the past, but if you look at the forecasts, what we're being offered is forecast by the OECD to be the second lowest growth rate in the G7 this year, the lowest in the G7 next year. In fact, the lowest growth in the whole of the OECD next year, all bar Russia. And if that is what Jeremy Hunt has to offer, then I can tell you that our offer is very different, because we are determined to bring growth back to the UK economy, to ensure that working people are better off, to unblock the things that are discouraging investment by British businesses and global businesses in Britain today. And so the outlook for the UK under a Labour government, through stability after the chaos we've seen, investment alongside businesses in the jobs and the industries of the future, and reform to our planning system, our pension system, our skills system, and the New Deal for working people, to ensure that Britain has that strong growth that we need to lift living standards and to make working people better off. Well, I answered that because it is different, George, if you've got an independent Office of Budget Responsibility setting out how that's costed and how it's funded for. That's very different from setting out plans without any forecast. And it's telling, isn't it, that the Chancellor didn't ask the OBR to assess £46 billion of tax changes, because he knows that they are not affordable. And if they are affordable, it has to be through one of those things. It has to be cuts to public services, including the National Health Service, increases in other taxes, like the 8 percentage point increase in basic and higher rates of income tax, as Nigel Lawson warned, and as the House of Commons library numbers show, or reforms to the state pension, either putting up the state pension age by 5 years or means testing it. One of those things has to be true, and it's up to the Prime Minister and Chancellor to say which one it